if you're anything like me, you're into AI. You watch the videos, you read the Reddit threads, the agent demo, someone's new setup, and it's always kind of the same conversation. What's the cool new agent? What models are you using with the agent? What are the providers? And where's the hype at this week in AI? But there's one thing that almost no one really talks about too often, and that's that once you start using these models and once you start using these chatbots, AI, etc., your data is landing on some company's servers, and it stays there, and it could stay there for hours, it could stay there for days, weeks, years, and for the most part, no one's really talking about these various retention policies that are a part of these companies. But think about it this way, you wouldn't walk up to a stranger on the street and give them your schedule for the week, your client emails, and a list of your biggest fears. But that's effectively what we're doing when we use these various providers. We're sending the data off and we're just trusting the person or the company on the other side. Now, I do have an honest disclaimer in that I have tried my best to make sure that all of the data and content in this video is as accurate as I can make it. But everything in AI moves really fast and policies shift quickly. So what I really want to do is I want you to not take everything in this video as 100% accurate, even though I've done my best to make it as accurate as possible. I want you to use this video as a guidepost so that you can go off and look deeper into the retention policies of the model providers that you use so that you can be more thoughtful and conscientious about what providers you're using, how you're using them, and for what purpose. I think the best way to get started is with the word retention. So there are kind of three things to keep in mind when we're talking about data retention. First, what are they keeping? So a lot of times this includes the whole thing. This is what you're sending to the models, what the models are sending to you, along with all of the metadata. And metadata is effectively just information about your data. So if you have a file on your computer, the metadata would be stuff like when was the file created, who created it, when was it last modified, how big is the file, without being the actual contents of the file itself. That's what metadata is. It's data about data, information about data. The second thing to keep in mind is how long are they keeping it? So in some cases, the providers aren't keeping anything, in which is called like zero data retention, and other times they could be keeping it for 30 days, weeks, months, years. And so it's important to understand how long they're keeping it. And lastly, what are they keeping it for? Sometimes they're keeping it for abuse monitoring or legal reasons. They want to train their own models, etc. And all of these have varying degrees of risk that you should be aware of. And here is kind of like the crux of everything in a sense, is that when you actually delete something from ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc., that does not mean that it actually gets deleted. So you hit delete and that starts a timer. So for ChatGPT, that's 30 days. So 30 days after you hit that delete timer, ChatGPT then actually deletes your conversation. There was a previous legal and court order that required ChatGPT to keep stuff indefinitely, even after you delete it. That has since been lifted for the most part. And so currently, yes, when you hit delete on ChatGPT, it starts that 30-day timer. Kind of the same thing for Claude. So you hit delete in Claude, that 30 days starts at the end, then your prompts, your content context is actually deleted. Gemini is a bit more confusing because with activity off, there's a 72-hour floor, and then after which there are different account settings that might be your stuff is deleted in 30 days, 60 days, up to years. And Gemini and Google also can effectively randomly select content, prompts, etc. to be kept for human review up to 3 years. So even if you hit delete, this human reviewed data retention can be up to 3 years, regardless of whether you've deleted it or not. The retention window itself, though, can come with some inherent risks, if you say. So you hit delete, that retention window starts. So even though you have deleted it on your side, the company is still keeping a copy of it through that retention window. So during that retention window, that company could be breached by hackers. They could be subpoenaed by a court order. It's possible employees also have access to that data. So there are a lot of things that could happen to your data during that period of time. And if you have training enabled, training is kind of a no undo button if you want. So the way that training works is that when these models are training on data, they take a broad scope of all of the data they have to learn off of or to train off of, and they try to find patterns in it, right? These are large language models. So they're trying to find patterns to make themselves better. In general, these companies don't care about information that's specific to you. They're trying to find the patterns in the broader data to train their models from. Now, that doesn't mean that information specific to you can't leak into models or get memorized into models. So when you are putting stuff like, as it says here, like an API key that is potentially trained on, the model could memorize that API key and then it gets built into that model. And there are various research groups that have found that you can then later extract that very specific information from the model. So that's why you always see in almost any video, in almost any thread, everyone says don't put your API keys in, because you do not want these models to have that specific information about you. In the same vein, you should not be putting your social security number or other very specific personally identifiable information about you into these models that are training on your data, in the event that it gets memorized by the model and built into the training. And the one thing to always keep in mind is that if you are using free models, whether that's on OpenRouter or anywhere else, almost by default, training is going to be on. So if something is free, as it's always been in the age of internet, if something's free, you are the product. Now, at the other end of the spectrum is to go fully local. You're hosting LLMs on your hardware. In that case, you can control the retention window. There's obviously not going to be any training, any third-party servers or companies in your data that can keep it, train on it, etc. So you're never opening that retention window. Now, the downside to going full local is that you're just not going to have access to those powerful models that you can from cloud-hosted providers, whether that is the frontier models, the DeepSeek models, etc. You're not going to have those powerful models because most local hardware is not going to be able to appropriately support those models. Now let's start talking about some of the first-party providers or closed-weight providers, if you will. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google. Now, in general, when you use the app, your data stays in that app for as long as you have the account with them, unless you hit that delete button. So again, once you hit that delete button, then you kind of start that timer of the retention window, after which your chats are deleted from those servers. Now, this is a bit different than when you are using API keys with these various providers, because in general, those API keys kind of guarantee you to only have a 30-day window, and you don't have to do anything. It's kind of default that that 30-day window is going to exist, so you don't even necessarily need to go in and hit delete for chats. That 30-day window is just going to apply as a blanket. So we can look at it in a little bit more fine-grained detail here. So with ChatGPT, with Google, with Gemini, again, if you're using that consumer app, it's going to keep that data until it's deleted, which then starts the retention window. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that with all of these providers, training is turned on by default. That is something you need to go in and turn off. And also, there is the possibility that while your data is there, it could get flagged for possible human review, which obviously means that someone is taking a look at your data, your context, content, etc. Now, as you'll see here, there's some very different retention windows when training is on. So Claude has 5 years when training is on. Now Gemini is 18 months auto delete by default. You can lower that retention window if you want, but again, if your data is kept for human review, that could be up to 3 years, regardless of whether you are deleting that conversation or not. I do want to branch off here. So with regards to ChatGPT and the OpenAI API, there's still another option that a lot of people use, and that's Codex via OAuth. So that's utilizing Codex with your normal ChatGPT OAuth. A lot of people are using these in agents such as Hermes agent, OpenClaw, etc. And that falls into even kind of another bucket here, which I think will surprise a lot of people. So I do want to talk about it. So let's get started. This kind of generic policy with OpenAI, and that is, they talk specifically about ChatGPT, Sora, etc., and they are calling out that it's different, that this privacy policy does not apply to business offerings such as their API, right? So I'm just trying to kind of plant the seeds here that ChatGPT and its API are different. The next step, as I kind of further build this case, if you will, is another document from OpenAI, which says using Codex with your ChatGPT plan. That's exactly what I was just talking about. So if I go down here to data controls, again, we see that ChatGPT, again, this is ChatGPT with Codex, your training is on by default, right? So if I come down a bit further and it says, does OpenAI train on Codex usage, business, enterprise, education? It says, no, we don't train, again, business, enterprise, education. But for Pro and Plus, it says you need to turn off training. Continuing to build this case here. So hopefully, for the sake of OpenAI policies, I've now at least connected for you that ChatGPT and Codex are kind of connected by the same policy. So chat and file retention policies for ChatGPT. This effectively is going to be the same for Codex, as I was just showing you. So the thing to keep in mind here is the single line, right? Chats are saved to your account until you delete them manually, right? So that might be what you would assume, that, hey, ChatGPT, it's holding onto your content until you delete it. So Codex via OAuth to your ChatGPT account is keeping those chats until you delete them. So here is the trick. There is no way to delete your Codex via OAuth history. It just doesn't exist. I've looked in all of the screens, I've looked in all of the menus, the settings, etc. And this shocked me enough that I reached out to ChatGPT and OpenAI themselves to clarify this policy with me. So even if all of this has been a little confusing, ambiguous, if you will, this is an email response I received from OpenAI. So it says, hey, we understand you're seeking clarification on data retention, etc. for Codex CLI sessions authenticated via ChatGPT OAuth, right? Exactly what I said, Codex via ChatGPT OAuth. So data retention follows ChatGPT's consumer data retention. Your prompt and response is kept until you delete it. After retention, typically removed from OpenAI systems within 30 days unless retention is required for security or legal reasons. Pretty standard here. Again, this next one, signing with ChatGPT OAuth, usage is governed by ChatGPT consumer policy, etc. It says, although Codex CLI may use API endpoints behind the scenes, because it's authenticated through ChatGPT, it means that you fall into that ChatGPT retention policy. So training is disabled, your data is still retained until you delete it, after which it's then removed after 30 days. So you delete it, starts retention window, 30 days gets deleted. Now for the kicker, deleting Codex CLI session data. At this time, Codex CLI sessions authenticated through ChatGPT auth do not appear in your ChatGPT conversation history or the Codex cloud interface. As a result, there is currently no self-service or programmatic way to delete your individual CLI sessions. So that means your Codex via OAuth in OpenClaw, Hermes, VS Code, etc. There is no way for you to delete those sessions, and they are just hanging out effectively, indefinitely on OpenAI servers. So the only way to do user-initiated deletion is by deleting your entire OpenAI account. And at that point, once you delete your entire OpenAI account, Then it starts the deletion of data within 30 days, again, except for legal security retention requirements, etc. So I think this is a little crazy, and I think this is something that people do not talk about enough, and I'm not even done with this video. So just keep in mind that if you are using Codex via ChatGPT OAuth, you cannot delete that content. That stays on OpenAI servers until your whole account gets deleted. Okay, so let's talk about zero data retention. Now, ideally, I know I want, you probably want, we don't want any of these companies to keep any of our data for any amount of time, right? So some providers do offer zero data retention, and what that means is that they are not keeping any of your content, any of your context, prompts, etc. for longer than they need to. So I mentioned earlier at the start of this video, the idea of you walk up to a stranger and you tell them everything about yourself. Well, in keeping with that analogy, zero data retention would be you walk up to a stranger, you tell them everything about yourself, you guys have a nice conversation, they maybe give you some information or some help, and then as soon as you two walk away from each other, that person then forgets everything you just talked about. They forget that entire conversation. So when it says here that you have the request, the model processes it in memory, that's what that means exactly, is that model is only going to keep those requests, those prompts, for as long as that conversation exists. So once that conversation is done, once you clear that session, the model forgets everything, and all of that is gone off of the company server. So with zero data retention, there's never this idea of like a retention window for these companies, because these models forget that context very quickly and almost immediately. The next step in this process is aggregators, and aggregators are effectively routers that sit in between you and the model provider. So some of the more popular ones are OpenRouter, OpenCodeGo, and another one that I'm including in here, Deep Infra. And so they connect to these model providers, and what they do is they allow you to access a plethora, if you will, of models from different providers, so that you only need to sign up with one company to get access to all of those different providers. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that now you have another hop in your process of utilizing AI and utilizing these LLMs. And each stage in this process has its own retention window. So even these aggregators like OpenRouter, OpenCodeGo, Deep Infra have their own retention windows that you need to be aware of on top of the provider's retention window. Okay, so everything I was talking about before with Gemini, Claude, OpenAI, now you have an aggregator that's sitting in front of them that might have its own retention window. And so your retention window is kind of the collection or the join or the union of all of these retention windows. And whichever one has the longest retention window, that's the one that's going to apply to you the most. So if we take a little bit of a deeper look with some of these aggregators, one of the most popular ones is OpenRouter. Now, by default, OpenRouter is only keeping metadata. Again, that's data about your data. So they're keeping stuff like your IP address, what time you're prompting the provider, the size of your prompt, although they're not keeping the prompt itself, etc. Now, this changes. So as you see here, they're not training by default, but if you want to use their free models or you want to get specific discounts, you might turn on training. So that's a different lever you can pull. And again, if something's free, you're probably the product. So for those free models, training's probably turned on by default so that they can make their models better with your content. OpenCodeGo, they are not ZDR, so they are keeping data from you. They might not be training by default, but they are keeping your data. I'm going to talk about them a little bit more in just a second. So OpenCodeGo claims that they have ZDR relationships with providers, which is fine. So that hop to the provider might be ZDR, but OpenCodeGo themselves are keeping data on you. So Deep Infra, they are a provider. They actually host most of their models themselves, the exception being that if you are accessing something like Claude, Gemini, models through them, those get forwarded then to Google, Anthropic, etc. So that's when you need to worry about that other provider window as well. But by default, Deep Infra is not keeping any data on you. They are ZDR by default. And Near AI, it's probably a lesser known provider here. So they are providing their own models on their own hardware, and their privacy policy is TEE, or Trusted Execution Environment. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. But effectively, that means that everything is kind of hosted in a black box or a dark environment, and so they don't have any access to anything you're sending them anyway. So the data retention is kind of moot because they can't see any of your prompts to begin with. So I did want to look a little bit closer at OpenCode Go's own policy because I do think it's important. I did want to mention /share, which posts a kind of public link of your session, which obviously isn't great for that to be public. Not that it's easily found by people, but it does get posted public indefinitely, again, until you remove that yourself. So that's another call out for OpenCode Go. But I did want to talk specifically about their own privacy policy. So here we are on OpenCode Go, their privacy policy. Now, the first thing to keep in mind when you're looking at any privacy policy is kind of how they are categorizing things. So this is personal data and the categories of personal data. So the one to really keep in mind here is this last one. So information you voluntarily choose to provide, such as information included in your conversations or prompts that you submit to AI, right? So basically, whatever you're chatting with OpenCode Go models about, that is part of your personal data as they are defining it, right? So if I scroll down then to data retention, it says we retain personal data, right? We already defined what personal data is, and that's effectively whatever you might send the model. We retain personal data about you for as long as necessary to provide you with our services or perform our business or commercial purposes for collecting your data. So basically, they're keeping your data for as long as they want, right? Now, there are a number of states stuff here, right? So California residents, and there's a number of states here that are mentioned. So California, Iowa, Montana, yada, yada, right? A lot of different states, and these states have different rights, and you'll see that, you know, under here, California resident rights, you can request that they delete your personal data. Well, that immediately tells me that unless you're part of California, right, you can't request them to delete your data. You can't get your data deleted, which is important to know. But there's also certain exceptions to that request. One of those exceptions being if deletion of your personal data involves a disproportionate effort on their part, right? So that kind of sounds like that even if you request to have your data deleted, they just might still deny that request. So again, if you are using OpenCode Go, keep that in mind with all of these data retention policies. If you are part of some of these states mentioned up here, you might be able to request to have your data deleted, but they could still end up denying that request. I mentioned previously TEE, or Trusted Execution Environment, and that effectively means sealed hardware, so even the provider's staff don't necessarily have access to this data that you're submitting to these prompts. And the way that this is created is actually created by the chip makers themselves who build the hardware. So it's the Intels, the NVIDIAs who are creating this TEE, or sealed hardware environment that helps protect your data from even the providers. As we start to kind of bring all of this together, the questions that you need to ask yourself is, what is kind of your threat model, or what is the sensitivity of this data that you are submitting to the prompt? So if you're just asking a question about when the next full moon is, or something generic, well, you can use probably any model, and it doesn't matter if they keep your data anyway, right? Because there's nothing personal about you. Now, if you're providing stuff to the models that are client or proprietary, you're probably going to want to have, you know, the business or enterprise tier that has ZDR from some of these providers, or use a provider that has ZDR by default. And regulated such as health, legal, or stuff that has PII, which is personally identifiable information, you definitely want to go full local or have an enterprise agreement with these providers so they are guaranteeing you that there is no kind of data being retained on any of that, since there are going to be a lot of different compliance, legal ramifications for that kind of information that's stored at providers. So kind of last but not least here, what I want everyone to do is go through whatever provider you're using and make sure you're turning off training, you're turning off app activity, and you're just taking a deeper look at all of their security policies, their data retention policies, so that you know that whatever model you're using and whatever provider you're using aligns with whatever data security and data retention policies you are comfortable with. Now, I hope this has been helpful. If it has, please like, subscribe. I appreciate the time. I appreciate it if you've stuck with it through all of this. And I will see you in the near future. Thanks.